welcome back to the next installment of our presentation in the Fall Symposium on Migration in the Islamicate World, which is being coordinated along with the course CMENAS 493-593. So before we start and welcome our speaker for today, I'd like to also remind you of the next talk so that you have it on your radar in 2 weeks. Next week is fall break, but in 2 weeks from today we'll have our next talk by Kevin von Bledel from Yale University, who is professor of Near Eastern languages and civilization, who will speak on the reshaping of Persian after the 7th century Arabian conquest and colonization. So looking at the spread of languages and particularly conflict between Persian and Arabic in the early centuries of Islam. So please join us for that as well. This week I'm thrilled to introduce our next speaker in the series, who really connects very well with our last speaker, Professor Shamil Jeppe, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Historical Studies at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. Professor Jeppe received his PhD from Princeton University and has worked on numerous projects and different aspects of the social history of Cape Town and Durban, South Africa, as well as 19th century Sudan. At the University of Cape Town, he has led a National Research Foundation study group on history and the humanities in South Africa today, and serves presently on various platforms related to the development of the humanities as well as history and heritage in Africa and the Global South. And he has served as the director of the Institute of Humanities in Africa at the University of Cape Town. And most connected with today's talk, he has also founded the Timbuktu Manuscripts Project to explore the formation of culture and collecting in Timbuktu. And this will be related to his talk today. This is not Professor Jeppe's first visit to Michigan. We're actually thrilled to have him back. He was also here 2 years or 1.5 years ago to deliver the 2018 Mark and Constance Jacobson Lecture at the U of M Institute for the Humanities. He has published numerous books on his different areas of research. I'll just mention a few things to sort of give you a sense of his diversity and the stuff he works on. His first publication, The Struggle for District 6, Past and Present, about his home city, right? His city where he lives, Cape Town, and District 6, as well as Language Identity Modernity, the Arabic Study Circle of Durban, and towards New Histories for South Africa, and recently, from which you read for today here in the class, The Meanings of Timbuktu in 2008. He's also co-edited numerous books related to different aspects of his research, including the Timbuktu Project. And so today he will speak on libraries and mobilities. So please welcome me in joining Professor Shamil Jeppe.
Thank you very much, Professor Sweet, for that very generous introduction. And thank you for coming. I enjoyed my first visit here some months ago in the heart of winter. And you actually do have some good weather here, as I've experienced since yesterday. I don't know if it will last beyond Halloween, but thank you for inviting me. You know, it's a really nice, give me a different view of the place. So I have been working on this location, the settlement called Timbuktu, for more than a decade now. And I've had many great predecessors and fantastic colleagues working on and around this space. And what we tend to do is we tend to get fixated on location and on fixity and stability. And Timbuktu is indeed an urban settlement now. It emerged around early 11th century, and we tend to look for these locations. And what we often missed out is the fact that crucial to that region is the fact that people had to move between locations. That mobility has to be figured in centrally to any consideration of the history of that part of the world. In fact, I would say to any history, but let's just stick to Northwest Africa. We have to bring mobility or mobilities much more centrally into our conception of how the past unfolded. And of course, I don't need to tell you this, you know very well by now that the theme of migration is very deeply embedded in the histories of Islamic societies or Islamicate, the Islamicate world. People move, irrespective of religion, of creed, of ideology. We have an enormous capacity and appetite to wander and to move. People have to go work, gather food, go to the market, whether they use their feet or a donkey or horse or camel, etc., etc. It goes without saying then that mobility is central in the past of the Islamic world and in the contemporary Muslim world. Whether this mobility is through people's own volition or through enforced mobilities through crises, civil wars, Myanmar, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, etc., etc. So, no matter what aspect of Islamic history we look at, or what period, we have to figure in movement. Now, I've been looking at this generally, this theme of mobility, and I don't know if you know, but that this is a statistic from about 10 years ago, that at any one time in the air in the United States, there are about 670,000 people moving at any one time. That's a big town, just out there. So there have been people looking at mobilities in the contemporary moment, comparing it with the past, telling you, giving you all sorts of interesting statistics that the average human being today in the United States, this is average of course, moves around 50 kilometers a day. In 1800 it was 50 meters, etc., etc. So there are all sorts of interesting anecdotal bits that you can pick up, which may be difficult for various parts of the Islamic world, for Timbuktu for instance, but there are tantalizing hints in the material that I am going to show you, that references, that gives us allusions to movement and mobility. And if we read hard and close enough sources, we will be able to pick up. Of course, my concern of course is with not the movement of people, which you've been looking at, but really do people move without things? We don't move naked, we move with something, we move with clothing, we move, in my focus, with books. And how did people move with books, or how did they send or receive books? And I think what I want to introduce in addition to mobility is materiality, is the human and the thing. The fact that massive amounts of things move in our contemporary world, and books move. Now it's so easy these days. In fact, we sit in our bedrooms when a title comes up and you order something, and DHL or FedEx. In fact, if you go to an online store called Book Depository, which is now an Amazon subsidiary, it's a British-based business that was gobbled up by Amazon, you can see when you're buying a book, you can see there's a real-time map that shows you where else a book was just bought at the time you're buying something. Global map that shows you this move. So we are now can think of books again and mobility because of UPS and Amazon, FedEx. We're just receiving things. In fact, it has made libraries relatively old-fashioned, unfortunately, because we all can order our own things. I don't know, this happens, or you order a PDF or a digital copy and so on. I was interested to see on the aeroplane how many people were reading books, and many people were simply now reading on their phones and reading on the iPad. And I was one of the very few people who took newspapers from the stands. They were still offering, Air France was still offering old-fashioned hard copy newspapers. And I just took a gold stack in a long flight from Paris here. And I always travel with hard copy books, and I often lose them. I've lost, 2 flights ago, I lost a book of poetry, and I went to the KLM office for Lost and Found, and they simply dismissed me by saying, no, we don't keep books. I don't know what they do with the books. There must be some charity they give the books to. But I was thinking of the number of books. So it wasn't my first book. It happens quite frequently because I often wake up in a panic after a long flight and just what's happening and just don't look at what I'm taking. But this is people and things. You're moving with your books. I'm not going to try to advertise again, but I've discovered audiobooks. And that saves me a lot of having to carry things with me. And but that means I'm carrying something. I have to carry this phone. So let's take a tour of this region, and then I'll show you and tell you more about this thing, this book. Because a book is a thing. It's an object. And we can look at the dimensions of this object in that region. So let me, I should forget this. Yeah, so Professor Speech will know this map. It's a famous map from the Catalan cartographer Abraham Cresques. I think it was 1300s, and Timbuktu is already depicted around there, and that is a famous ruler of Timbuktu, a man called Mansa Musa, who was enormously wealthy. But what is interesting about this map is that it's a world of equals. It's not a poor South, a poor Africa. In fact, extremely wealthy people live here, and this becomes associated with the space. Wealth, especially gold. There was an obsession that there was gold, and there was indeed gold, but much further down. But this gives you an indication of the location across the, it's not the best copy, but you can go and look up the Cresques map project. There's a scholar who's been disentangling and making neat sections with explanations and translations of the Latin. So I don't know if he's completed the project, but you can go and see, and you'll see nice close-ups on that. This is what I want to get at. And so this is Timbuktu. And very often you will find maps in histories of Africa with such networks. These are rather random, but they are rooted in reality of movement between locations. Timbuktu and Walata, Timbuktu and Arawan, and up to Marrakesh. That's going to be significant at some point in the talk, because you're going to see why. But all along there are there are networks that have developed over time, connecting centers, and people have moved over a long period in that region. Not for nothing, one of the words associated with this region is the nomad. And it is a region with a long tradition of nomadism. We have the big centers, such as CMENAS, Fez, Marrakesh, throughout coastal North Africa especially, and then you come to Timbuktu and so on. But otherwise, from south of this area, this is the world of the nomad, of seasonal migration, of very complicated relationships with the territories they inhabit, of deep knowledge of where there are water wells, points for stopping. And it is, of course, the terrain about which the great North African philosopher and historian Ibn Khaldun was not very complimentary. Because for him, civilization was urban. The Omran, the word for civilization, was the city. And the cycle of history is between the city and the other, the countryside, the Badu, the nomad, the nomadic space. And what we're learning with all this history of intellectual production in the Sahara is that we have to shift that Khaldunian thesis. So we know now, in terms of the work I've been doing, Timbuktu for me has come to be more a symbolic expression for that region. For that region, at least for connecting this place called Arawan, which is well known for its salt, Walata, which was another scholarly town, Jenny, another scholarly town. In other words, it had scholars, it has writers, Gao, which was a center of politics. But for a long time, when I speak of Timbuktu, I don't fix on that location, although there is a way in which we've come to be fixed on that location. But it's much more one node in a network of great mobility that we have to think of. Now this is, I'll just come back to that piece of Arabic. This is Timbuktu in an aerial shot, and it's by the 17th century, it was already a highly complicated urban center. So you'll see narrow streets, people will talk of quarters, of markets and various mosques, of cemeteries and so on. So it was kind of it wasn't simply a settlement any longer, or flat, unsophisticated. You can get better maps, and colleagues have done fairly detailed maps of the way in which the quarters work and so on. So we know about it. It doesn't get the attention that other big cities get to the north, but it has an urban character.
It's interesting. It's almost grid-like if you look at
Yes,
the
yes,
map
yes.
on the. I mean, the city center is a little crowded, but you can actually see
No,
the
they
development
are.
of a grid system on the outer edges of the city.
And there are main thoroughfares and so on. So one can do, I'm just very bad with these images. So I fear when I import things, they're just not going to show up and so on. I came here 2 hours before just to get this plugged in. But I can show you, yes, there are images of exactly what you're saying. And just to give you a sense of this is one of the oldest mosques, Sankore. All the buildings, historic buildings, are mud brick buildings. And so they have to be reinforced annually. You have big ceremonies where the whole town, usually around the Maulud, the Prophet's birthday, where they get reinforced, and these walls are this big, and it's deadly hot outside but cool inside. And I mean, it's just ecologically appropriate architecture and so on. but it's quite fascinating. In terms of mobility, this is about 13 kilometers from Timbuktu, the Niger River. So this is the Timbuktu port, and there's movement along the river when the waters are high enough. So just to give you an idea. Now, let me stop now. So, a story about the first example. Now, I just assume there must be now lost evidence of movement of books and things. But my first personality I want to talk about is the person who is most closely associated with scholarly history of Timbuktu, and he's a man called Ahmad Baba, who dies in 1627. And if you look at his genealogy and the narratives around his ancestry, it's filled with he moved, he came, he went. You know, and he was expelled by the ruler and he took his books with him. So if you reread these narratives, you'll find this coming in there. Scholars are not going to move without some of their books. And we know from his great-grandfather the stories of falling out with rulers or getting invited to be a judge elsewhere. So they moved, and we know that they took their books along with them. So Ahmad Baba, in his ancestry, he has this, and he suffers exile in 1591 after the Moroccans from Marrakesh, the Saadian dynasty, a dynasty that emerges in Marrakesh. It's a dynasty, short-lived dynasty, relative to others, and proceeds to sack Timbuktu, and then he is exiled, and he is taken to Marrakesh. It takes him almost a year to cross the desert and go on. And what happens, we know, when he is released, firstly, when he arrives in Marrakesh, the local scholars of Marrakesh had already heard of him. Quite interesting, very far off. They had heard of him, and they plead with the ruler, Mansour, that he should not be imprisoned, but he should be allowed to teach in the mosque, a kind of house arrest, teach in the mosque. And he was very productive in Marrakesh. In fact, I estimate that most of his works were produced in Marrakesh, probably because he had access to more works, or he wanted to assert his scholarly pedigree and authority. It's so on, but I'm not talking about his all the genres he wrote in at the moment. But what he does when he's released finally, he has some harsh words for the rulers, and he says, "And give back my 1,600 books that you took." So I see no reason why that number had to be made up. It is a late report it's a scholar called Al-Ifrani who dies in 1743, who gives this report. And as scholars with training to be suspicious and skeptical and get evidence and so on, we always ask these questions. Why is it there? But here is a case. His library was shipped, and I can understand. It's quite plausible that this is what happened to him. Moaning, complaining, and that given the nature of the rulership that this Marrakesh dynasty established over Timbuktu and that region, this is the nastiness of their rule. This is what they would have done. That's the first major example. At the same time, 1600s, this area here was beset by Iberian powers, particularly Portuguese. there are numerous enclaves here that are run by the Portuguese, and the Spanish and the Portuguese compete amongst each other, and it's quite a mess of counter alliances amongst the various dynasties and one or other Spanish force or Portuguese force. It's during the 16th and 17th century. And there are reports that libraries were shipped to the Escorial, to the Madrid. This is, so just to refer to that, in 1611, from the coast, libraries were shipped off. So that's happening there also. So there's a whole history of book theft that we can work on, in fact. So there's book theft, we have willful, organized plan, taking of books. If you're moving Ahmad Baba's ancestors, taking it to Walata, taking it elsewhere, having copies made, and then you have sheer theft of books. I don't know how much of that still happens in libraries. Okay, now the other story. Then, I'm just trying to give you more stories. After the rulers of this Saadian dynasty, they discover they're not really getting much out of Timbuktu. The upper leadership, the upper level leadership simply leave Timbuktu, and they leave their foot soldiers there, many of whom were ancestors of Iberian men who had fled and families who had fled in the reconquest and so on. And so they were actually Iberian foot soldiers who were just left totally clueless as to what to do. Their generals had returned, and they constitute a kind of anarchy. It's anarchic, sort of under these characters who are called the Arma, and there have been lots of work on the Arma and the impact of the Arma on the locals. There are also many very light-skinned Iberians who intermarry with locals. And so they are about from a century and a half of disorder, chaos, anarchy, and so on. Of which there's some scholarship, and I won't talk about that, but the next sort of instance of book mobility that I can tell you about is from the 19th century, when a big scholar arrives in Timbuktu from Arawan, from the spot, called Sidi Mukhtar al-Kunti. And we know from one of his descendants in the 1830s who go to Marrakesh, and he goes to what I can only describe as a book buying expedition, because he comes back and we have a list of about 200 books that he bought. So he went and had a great time at the book emporium of Marrakesh. And I have an article which, if you're interested, on comparing the Ahmad Baba, it's an article that focuses more on collecting, on the nature of book collecting in that part. Yes, so we found a list with 200 items, and these are the genres it covers: Quranic studies, 27 items, 51 works on hadith, 25 on Arabic grammar and language, 20 on tawheed or theology, and on tasawwuf, and on tib or medicine, and 77 on fiqh, or jurisprudence. Okay, so that's the 19th century. This is, by the way, I thought, I started thinking how early back in general, sort of broader Islamic history, can we find references to movement of books. And a colleague sent me a very early narrative. This is probably the earliest narrative I'm going to find about a companion, Ibn Abbas, and it talks of his Majmu'ah Dahma, a big collection which was a big collection of books, which was, this is fascinating, which was carried or transferred on the back of a camel. And it goes on talking about this, when a book is requested and so on. Now, I'm of your Arabists, but I thought throwing a bit of classical Arabic in there for the Arabists amongst you would be good. This is a very nice little narrative. What it doesn't say, it has no discussion on the weight that the camel can actually bear. You know, apparently, I have not found a source, but there is a medieval Islamic source which involves a discussion around how many books a camel can carry. But this actually refers to a large number of books on a back of a camel. So that's from early Islamic history, from the 1st century already. My own work that I'm doing most closely is by a 20th century figure. And I've been going to Timbuktu for many years, and I was always fascinated by the numbers of things that people had. I would go and spend weeks there and be dragged to more and more families with huge collections. And I'll show you some images, just piles of books, you know, totally disorganized, totally, I used to get quite scared because you can't really do anything. As scholars, we work with catalogs and with organized tools. And you know what? We actually doing work quite comfortably with such instruments, which people had done for us in the 19th century. I don't know, Professor Speech, in your field, you know, many of these things are just there. You take it for granted. There's a catalog, there's a list, there's an edition, there are volumes done, and we work with these things. When it came to this area, it was, I have to think of myself as a 19th century gentleman, where I have to do these lists and these catalogs and these editions. It was just unbelievable, the amount of material. So I thought, where do these things come from? How? And one man's name came up all the time. His name was Ahmed Bul-Araf, and I've written about him various essays, and I'm writing a monograph on him at the moment. And he comes, again, he comes from this area. Sorry, just so that you want to know his name, Ahmed Bul-Araf, and that's his handwriting. And he comes in the late 19th century. There's a big crisis in southern Morocco, and he leaves there. The next thing we hear of him in Timbuktu in 1904 or 1907, it's still unclear. I've gone to visit this area, and from the tribal confederation that he was part of, and they were very honest with me. They said, we've never had scholars. We are not scholarly people, we are merchants. And they were equally fascinated by that this figure could become such a legendary figure in the constitution of at least one tradition of books and book collecting in Timbuktu. So I've managed to find that somewhere along the way he goes to this place called Shinqit, which is a legendary place by this time in the history of Islamic learning in that area. And he probably goes and sits at the feet of a scholar or goes to the madaris, the madrasas. He picks up Islamic learning because he comes to Timbuktu, and we gather later on he's collecting manuscripts and he is commissioning copies. Clear evidence of this. In his correspondence, he's writing all over the place. I want this. I need that page from this manuscript because I'm trying to constitute a complete copy. And I've got a lot of these materials that I've now been collecting. He's a really concerned. He is a merchant, like his family and the broader tribal confederation that he's part of in that area, because he's selling Moroccanery, leather, tea, whatever he can, he sells that, but he's also investing a lot of his wealth in buying and later on selling books. Firstly manuscripts, but later on also printed works. And this is his origin. There, I don't know if he went to the French capital, Saint Louis at the time, the French colonial capital, but he arrives in Timbuktu, and then he carries on a correspondence with these places in this blue. All the correspondence is about books. All the correspondence about books. Here is one letter, and we ask for the Tariq Ibn Khaldun. And I've got recently found a whole body of correspondence in the Moroccan archives. If you want to come and see, all with lists of books that he's ordering from booksellers all over. This is not quite a clear handwriting. Now, what enables this? Firstly, in the time of Ahmad Baba, it's the camel. The books were taken by camel. There's no other transport. They either taken by camel or by camel and by human beings with package on their backs. This is the only form of transport they had. There was nothing else. By the time of Ahmad al-Araf, when he arrives in Timbuktu, the French arrived there in 1898 in Timbuktu. They had sacked Timbuktu, and the French started very early on bringing motorized transport. They use camels, they use horses, they use donkeys, they use whatever they can because they must move. It's enormous territory that they control, an enormous territory control. And one of the things they want to do is to actually have control, or not so much control, but information to control. Empire is nothing without information. You need knowledge. And what you need is a network of posts and so on. So they establish a network of post offices that anybody can use, but that's connected to the military posts. So that's the first wave. And then they have a kind of private system of mail. They allow private businesses, or they invite private businesses to do the transport of mail around the colony. And this is what I found in the archives, which is, from the 1920s, a register of a schedule of departure and arrival times for mail in the colonies. And Timbuktu is on one of these things, if not on one of these, and on subsequent pages. But it's colony-wide, where they were very organized. This, at least in theory, is how it was meant to work. But it seems to have worked. And they issued special postal stamps for the French Sudan. I have not, the French post office has a fantastic scholarship opportunities for people interested in working in the history of the French post office, but not a single thesis on the post office in the colonies. Not that I've come across by repeatedly going to their website, trying to find out how it worked. But from my archival research, I found out quite a bit. Now, I will come back to this. So, what we do look at is a man who has no problem in using the emerging modern forms of communication. We notice these letters. In some letters, he openly refers to the post office, and he tells his people he's corresponding with to take it to such and such a tailor in Fez who will take it to the post office, and so on. So, and he'll pay for the postage. He's openly, no problem with it. Why I say this? Because you will know, as students of Islamic history, with the emergence of modernity and so on, all sorts of questions arise. Are we allowed to use this? Can we travel with Christians? Can we use a car? What do we do in an aeroplane when it's time for prayer? You know, these kinds of questions come up. He seems to not, there's nothing on this kind of thing with him, on any of these forms of transport or using the services of the colonial powers. Okay? Just one last thing about him. His major work is a biographical dictionary, which again students of Islamic history will know is a major source of information. It's called Kitab al-Tarajim, simply listing names of scholars in a particular field. So the Maliki scholars, you would have a listing and so on. He publishes this just before his death, and I'm working on an edition of it at the moment. And over time of looking at all his materials, I've discovered these pages with big gaps in. I've got many more pages of such gaps. Sorry. And I discovered then letters in which he's asking for information about certain scholars. And it was a sort of, this is his research process. So he writes a name, Ibrahim bin Muhammad al-Amin, and then he'll leave space because he's collecting more information. And then he'll fill out more and fill out more. Because if you look at sometimes what this entry it comes to in the actual final product is a longer one. So for those of you who are interested in manuscript studies, it's fascinating the way in which you organize this material and the various steps you went about to complete his work. Okay. Then we found this, which I was absolutely fascinated by. Publishers in Algeria. He must have been such an enthusiastic consumer of their books that they produced envelopes with his name on. So that they just like not write out anymore, his address in Timbuktu, but stacks and stacks of envelopes, and they're par avion, email to Timbuktu. And this was a network, sorry, it's not, I couldn't shift it around. This was a draft of a scheme by the French for a telegraphic system in French West Africa. So communication, information, mobility, it's all connected. Finally, in conclusion then, I decided to take mobility really seriously when I learned of what happened in the crisis in Timbuktu in 2011, when there was the forces, so-called Islamist forces, moved in, occupied Timbuktu, and the library owners in Timbuktu hid their books and then silently, quietly them out of Timbuktu. I don't know, this is a well-known story. There are some popular works about this, and they shipped them out. This is supposedly what happened to the libraries. Books were burnt and so on. This is really exaggerated. If you see most of these things were the enclosures in which the manuscripts were kept, what these guys found were basically empty enclosures. They found, they went to the wrong location actually, and they found empty. So it was basically an exaggeration. What was happening all the time was actually quietly the books were being taken out to Timbuktu. And I was absolutely astounded by this. And this is how they arrived in Timbuktu, in these crates. Fairly nicely kept and so on. But 800 meters, it went 800 meters south. 800 kilometers south. And this really got me thinking about the mobility of the materials. There must be, I don't want to say in the genes or, in the memory and so on, but there must have been this facility with the movement that they could do this so easily, so quickly, so knowledgeably. And this is how these enclosures, these were all now kept in the capital. Now, let me just conclude. I was amazed when I found that globally, we haven't thought enough about how things moved. So guess where this is? This reminded me of those other images. Look at that. This reminded me of a, this is in Aix-en-Provence, in the French colonial archives. And this is how they received their bags and bags of documents from their colonies as they constituted their archive d'outre-mer, their overseas archives. And it looks like exactly the other way. Yeah. This is how it was done. That's just how things were transported. And in all the manuals on libraries for library science people, for archival science students and so on, that I've looked at, and there are 3 major works that all go back to a Dutch work, and then there's a British version, and then there's an American version on library management and archival management and document care and so on. I can't recall much reference or any reference to how do you move books that they can maintain the integrity. Because look at what's happening there already. Sorry. Every time you move with a book, it may get lost, like my books on the airplane when they tell me they don't keep books. So things get lost. I know, and all of us know as students, I left a lot of things behind when I moved, every time I moved apartments. And when I left Princeton for South Africa, I had a load of things in various people's basements and lofts and so on, which I just couldn't afford to take back with me, or I don't know where they are, and they go to the annual book sales and so on. That's the beneficiaries are other future graduate students and so on. So I think that we need to reinsert mobility of things with people, whether they, and in particular the book, and look wherever we see mobility of people out of their own volition or under duress. What are they taking with them in terms of their books? Whether it's, and how do we make them comfortable where they are, people with the books that they will know or live with and so on. I'm glad to see that there's an increasing attention to libraries. Recently there was a book, I saw this in the bookshop here, about a big library fire many years ago in California, and this writer goes and investigates how this fire came about. But all these investigations of libraries and attentions to libraries, this question of mobility again, of moving in and out, of using, of circulating, of loss with it and of gains with it. We need to reinsert that. And in my area, it's ripe for doing. So thank you very much, I think.
Well, thank you, Professor Jeffy. As we did last week, I think that the way to proceed will be to take general questions, especially from people not in the class. We'll start with you, and then if we get tired, we'll take a break and then have more class meeting for another hour or until 4. So any questions from anyone at this point, but especially anyone who's not in the class and who's kind of entered the discussion.
What was the role of like the written word parchment? Is it called the mushaf? What was the role of that in movement?
Yes. What is interesting, so the mushaf is the copy of the Quran. There are actually very few copies of the Quran in these collections. There are parts of it, yes, but the whole mushaf is very rare. Now, I think because producing a copy of the Quran was a very special thing, and you allocated that to the best calligrapher, and it takes a long time. It's a long time, it's a big work, and the mushaf that I've seen in Timbuktu, the most beautiful one, comes from outside of Timbuktu, comes from Morocco. I've thought a lot about it, because the immediate sort of thing is, well, Islamic societies, it's the Quran, but actually it's not. Because for many, the Quran is in the heart. The Quran is memorized. The Quran is living in other ways, not in the book as an object. That's my response. I think in all the collections, there's a distinct absence of the mushaf of the Quran. And I think because it's really what we should not do in my concern with materiality and the book and writing and calligraphy and all that is write out the centrality of orality and of oral memory and of memorizing the Quran, which you see those kids there. You know, this is not an historic photograph. This is a photograph. This is a photograph that I took not too long ago. That's how they learn the Quran. The only thing they will have there is a board, is a wooden board, where they'll learn the lesson for the day, and they'll wash the lesson off, and then they'll write a new lesson, and they'll go on, and it's a cacophony of sounds there, because they're all reciting it loudly. Every other student reciting it loudly, and then they wash it off, and then they do it. So there's a lot of writing and reading going on that disappears off the face of it, of the support, which is called a lawh in Arabic, and in various other words in African languages. I don't know if I'm answering it.
Interesting. Thank you.
I'm not a scholar of this, but I'm fascinated. I'm not clear, though, what happened when the books were removed from Timbuktu. They removed
800 kilometers, yeah.
kilometers. Are they lost? Were
No,
they
no. So
found?
they kept in facilities in the city. I was very skeptical and critical of that, but I wasn't living there, and I'm not from there, you know. But as an outsider, I followed it very closely, and I'm very intimate with the people who were doing the moving. Firstly, because Timbuktu is a dry climate. 800 kilometers south, it's very humid. Timbuktu, these books could survive in Timbuktu for so long, even though they were now in need of repair and there were some things disappearing, getting sort of moth-eaten or so on. But the temperature is relatively stable. Very different conditions south. And we're also finding south of Timbuktu, generally, the Islamic written tradition really decreases, falls. It could be the environmental conditions. So that's my first concern. And so what has had to be done was high-end aircon, which you couldn't afford and you can't do in Timbuktu, except with big donor funding, which, you know, when I was involved in building a new archive there, and we got world experts in, and they suggested building a vault with such thick walls that will enable a consistent temperature. And I don't know if there are any library or conservation experts in there, but it's around 26 degrees Celsius. I know you don't do Celsius. But there's a certain mean temperature that's really the perfect situation. That's why you go into conservation rooms. It's the same temperature day and night, year in, year out, that they recommend. Now, in this vault, these vaults, that was what was recommended for storage, where each of these enclosures would also mean a consistent temperature and sort of environment. So they are now being kept in this space, in this very humid space, and a lot of money has had to be raised. Mali is Africa's second poorest country or thereabout, for keeping the electricity on. But there's a lot of work going in to catalog them now with German funding, to catalog, to really know what's happening. We've worked with very inadequate instruments. That's why the work has been so slow and so problematic in some ways, because historians, we use very little instruments, but there are things we just have to have. Good search tools, for sources. When you have archival materials, you really need to know that you can trust that this is where it is.
Can you just kind of explain more on the type of tools that an historian would use to try and dig up this kind of information?
Yeah, no, that's very good. We need catalogs. We need good catalogs. And what I mean by that is that there were catalogs for a small fraction of what was there, and very inadequate. And a catalog will tell you, there was one national archive which was there, and this was funded by UNESCO in the 1960s, and they got a senior scholar there and some young researchers who went out to the surrounding. So you have Timbuktu as like the urban centers, and then you have these little settlements of 200 people and 500 people, and then these nomads who move around. And the nomads learn. The nomads teach and write. That's fascinating about what's, Ibn Khaldun couldn't see. They're producing knowledge. So highly literate people are coming out of that, and the center for this is now Mauritania. But then you had them going out, and what they actually did, what they used to go and barter with the locals. We'll give you a sheep, and you give us your collection. And they'll say, no, we want a cow. I did some oral history with these early founders of it, and I like this idea of a camel for a collection, goats. Oh no, 2 goats for the books, because the things were disappearing, and UNESCO, African history was emerging as a discipline in the 60s, so they put in some effort and they provided some funding, but they weren't paying people, they were having some kind of material exchange, and livestock was what people wanted or needed. So they constituted a national archive, but then many people didn't want to leave with their family patrimony because it was the only thing that they had or considered valuable and as inheritance. But so family collections would disintegrate because it would go to 5, usually more like 15 kids or something, many kids and grandchildren and so on. So things got, and consequently what you have was like 28 private libraries or more of varying size. Let me just tell you now, as an historian, for a national archive, a good cataloging system which will identify author, title, page, dates, conditions under which they were found, as much metadata as possible, size of page, type of handwriting, and that you can actually find when you ask for it. That you can actually access. And now digitization. Digitization has revolutionized the things. There are strengths and weaknesses. There's nothing better than actually going to touch that and handle it. But it's very expensive and now very dangerous to go to Timbuktu. And now I can ask somebody send me that digitally. And I've collected a lot digitally. We've collected a lot. But there are problems because things can then just circulate. You don't know where, if it's not properly inscribed with data of where it comes from and so on. Also, if you're not doing high enough digitization, high quality, things like the age of the paper. We've had cases of fraudulent attributions and copies that were claimed to be originals and so on, that you can't really identify until you feel this is paper made much later, factory made paper, and it's not artisanal paper and so on. So these are some of the things but our needs are very basic, but things like a search tool that will enable you to find something, and that will enable a second and a third and a fourth scholar to find the same thing without getting lost.
Can you describe maybe a little bit more, I'm just wondering about the identities of these scholars who are purchasing large sums of books, and the book merchants, sort of their socioeconomic background, how much is it costing, is there bartering going on, or sort of, who are these people who are selling and buying?
Yeah, so I just got this fairly recently, which is a major find for me, of a substantial amount of correspondence with booksellers in North Africa and the Middle East. And so I can make a kind of quantification of this stuff. Yeah, I'm quite curious. Firstly, I know what kind of things he wanted. Fairly interesting. Ibn Khaldun he wanted. Some Islamic modernists, like he wanted. I don't know how he got, because he's really, it's back country. So things travel. I can pick up from reading the French archives, the information gathering. They were alert to what was happening. And so things were moving. Fascinating magazines and journals. They were concerned with Moroccan nationalism spreading, to these areas and so on. Look, you had to have some surplus. It wasn't a necessity.
Right.
So he was a merchant. and whatever surplus he had, he used for that. But I can't really give you the economic history really, because I don't know how much other things he was selling. You know, what was he actually gaining from tea
Right.
sales in Timbuktu? It can't be big numbers, you know.
Yeah.
Tea, leather goods, some utensils he was importing from. But I know this larger confederation that he was part of, and his family, and they worked like that, called the Beirut. They were and they still have fame for being traders. Cattle, camels, or whatever. And when I went to that, his ancestral town, Gilmeen, and went to the now head of this confederations, I mean, I was treated royally, and we could see they were very comfortable people by the standards of you know, even of just more developed Moroccan settlements. You know, what vehicles they had, the houses they lived in, and so on. So I don't want to talk of class, but it would definitely be middle class people, you know. He is one, but I don't think he's the only one in that period. And he's sending his materials down as far as northern Nigeria, to Moroccan contacts in Kanu. I went to Kanu, can't find any Moroccan descendants still there. But the Moroccan diaspora from the late 19th century is quite deep into Cote d'Ivoire, northern Nigeria. It's quite extensive. And I think he uses that network. But yeah, I can't, but it's a good question. I mean, it's a question that I have all the time,
Right.
but unless I can show. But I can show you some of the titles here, you know, and he must be reselling them. He's ordering to resell them. That's the only explanation I have.
Thank you. Could you talk a little bit more about how Timbuktu sort of emerged as a center for, how like Timbuktu emerged sort of as a center for learning and all of that?
Yeah, that's, you know, it from what we understand, it was a kind of one of these entrepôts connecting traders, nomadic traders coming from the south and north, bringing salt with others coming from the south. That's sort of the standard picture. And eventually a settlement emerged there. There's some new archaeological work. It's actually becoming quite more interesting, lively period for that earlier history, very much driven by archaeologists. And you know, often you know, it's bits of information scattered over long periods and so on. But we do have, for the broader region, and south of Timbuktu, there's a place called Jenny, Jenne, and Jenny has the world's largest mud brick mosque, very famous. I think that's the Jenny Mosque on the stamp also. That mosque is the Jenny. Let me show you. So the archaeologists have found very early evidence of urbanization at Jenny. I think that's Jenny. There's lots of evidence for urban settlement by the 8th century, thereabouts. From written evidence for Timbuktu, you know, big gap. And then you have the chronicles, which is 16th century, Tariq. And even that's coming up for new revision. But there's a lot of deeper history in the Tariq, like on Ahmad Baba's father and Ahmad Baba himself, or grandparents and so on. You know, genealogies of the kings. Even Ibn Khaldun has king lists for the kings of Mali. So what you do have, and for a long time, and as for so many histories, it's histories of the dynasties. It's dynastic histories, it's the rulers and their machinations and doings and so on. So many of these chronicles can just be, as Henry Ford said, one damn thing after the other, you know. It's just lists of these names, you know, and you get hit over the head. And that's why the genre of the biographical dictionary is so interesting, because these were scholars who said, let's give place to scholars. You know, they are not the rulers, they are not the umara and the kings and so on. So we have these mixed sources which are all currently in a very interesting time undergoing new sort of revisionistic thinking, more critical and so on, bringing in the new archaeology, bringing in critical reading of these sources and so on.
Well, maybe this is a good moment to take a break, short break. Those who want to leave can. If you'd like to stay, whether you're in the class or not, feel free to. And maybe we'll come back in 5 minutes and have a bit more discussion. So thank you. Please join me in welcoming Professor so far. Come back to Laura.